Hey everyone. So this is, as I mentioned in class, just a quick introduction to Charles Darwin and the readings that you're going to be doing for Wednesday. So Charles Darwin, as I'm sure you probably know, was a biologist. He is generally seen as kind of the founder, the father, the originator of the field of evolutionary biology, and probably the foremost figure who initially articulated the theory of evolution and something called natural selection. He was born in 1809. He died in 1882, so he's operating in the 19th century. The works that you read in your selections are On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, and then his later work, The Descent of Man, in 1872, which looked at human evolution and sexual selection. Darwin, as a scientist, was really interested in how species originated and how, and specifically why, they developed over time. He had two things that kind of make his articulation stand out, and it's probably the reason why he became known as the primary figure in presenting a theory of evolution. The first was observational data. He had a host of observations on adaptation, his work on the HMS Beagle, and other field research that he had done. He had gone to the Galapagos Islands and done field research there. He had done extensive work with barnacles, examining barnacles in his field research. And what he saw was that different varieties of species, in particular, he was interested in pigeons and finches and some small mammals like rabbits and foxes and things like that. They would develop different qualities over time. And so his puzzle was to figure out, well, how? Why do they develop differently over time? What explains that? And he had a compelling theory. He had this theory of natural selection. Basically, in a very quick nutshell, natural selection is the idea that animals are in competition for survival, and there are finite resources that they need in order to survive. And lack of access to those resources is going to result in death. So those that die are least suited to the environment because they lack the physical traits to survive. Those that live have physical characteristics that are best suited to the environment, and those traits are heritable, meaning that they can be passed along. They can be passed on to offspring. Today, we would say they're embedded in the genetic material in some way, but that wasn't yet part of the conversation. It wasn't part of the lingo because the whole genetic structure and role of genetic material hadn't really been fleshed out yet. But what this means, this heritability, means that over time, certain physical characteristics become favored, and this leads to more and more individual animals having those characteristics. And nature is the driver of this process. Changes in the physical environment over time, over many generations, lead to changes in the organism to the point where animals with a common ancestor over millions of years become so different as to seem like different species altogether. They appear unrelated because of that gradual change over time as they adapt to their environment. The implications of Darwin's work are pretty radical. He potentially undercut the Christian creationist account, right? And that's really the biggest challenge. It's probably, if you haven't had Darwin in biology class or been exposed to it there, you're certainly aware of some of the confrontations still playing out in society today about the creationist account versus the evolutionary account and how they're butting heads. And people within those two camps can't seem to really grasp the other side. There's conflict there. Okay, so that's the big one. Also, at his time, in Darwin's time, his theory undercuts some of the existing science, some of the existing explanations. There's something called the transmutation of species. Basically, the idea that species have some internal mechanism that regulates their gradual development over time. There was what Jean-Baptiste Lamarck called the great chain of being, and that this internal mechanism of a specific species over time regulates the process by which a species becomes more complex and it begins to adapt and change. There were also lots of scientific theories that mixed together elements of what today we would call evolution with a creationist account, right? So there's evolution is happening, species are changing, their traits are changing, but the driver for that is divine. The driver is God, right? And he would come along and say, no, the driver is nature, right? The driver is changes in the physical environment, availability of resources, and the types of physical characteristics that are favored by those changes in environment, and how that material, those physical characteristics get passed on through heritable traits, right? So, so he was challenging the science. He was challenging the Christian and religious accounts of creation that have a moment of creation, right? And there are also lots of contemporaries at this time that were right on the cusp of articulating evolution. They were right on the verge of arriving at this discovery. So at the time that Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, he was racing to beat these challengers to the punch. He mentions that in the introduction. I will say Darwin's work is dense and it's challenging. So take your time with it. Try to read as much as you can. Use the reading questions to help you focus in on what's important. Just do the best that you can. As you do so, think about the following things. One, was Darwin what you expected? Many people, many students that I've had picture Darwin as this kind of fire-breathing radical, and he's condemning religion and presenting his arguments very forcefully. Do you think that's accurate? Having read Darwin, does he strike you as this, kind of radical that's smashing what came before him and putting forth his argument very forcefully? How would you describe the tone of his work? Okay. Two, try to assess Darwin's method, his arguments. What is his method? What is he using to make his case? What is the evidence? What is his argument? If you were reading this at the time, what do you think the weaknesses of his argument are? He presents this case for an account of evolution and natural selection. Do you think are there weak spots? What are they? What would you critically look at and kind of question if you were presented with this argument at that time? Three, does Darwin's account force us to rethink that Baconian imperative to master and subdue nature? Remember, this is what Francis Bacon was saying, is we have to kind of treat nature as if it's this raw material that we human beings shape and control. Darwin puts a different spin on that and potentially kind of undermines that. So I'd be interested to see what you think. If Bacon and Darwin were in a conversation with one another, what would that look like? And then lastly, what are the implications of Darwin's work for religious accounts of creation? Is this kind of the nail in the coffin of those accounts? Or is there a way that these two things can potentially coexist? Can one believe in a creator and a moment of creation and still believe in the Darwinian account of evolution? So we can also discuss anything that the discussion leaders would like to talk about, anything that your classmates would like to discuss. But those are some basic ideas that maybe as you're reading you can think about those. Okay, so I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Thanks.